Chapter 292. The Indian Maidservant and the Old Saudi Man, Part 2. For inexperienced passengers like Rehana Khan and her daughter, the airplane wasn't much fun at all. Whatever she had heard from the gossip mongers in the slums about plane crashes, hijackings and mid-air explosions all came to mind when she boarded the Saudi plane. Her heart began to increase its rhythm the moment the air hostess practically dragged her and her daughter inside the plane and showed them to their seats. The same air hostess who had gotten them their boarding cards and fastened their seat belts, smiled at them, and left. In haste, no one had bothered to ask them for their passports. When they entered the boarding ramp with the Arab air hostess, another member of the flying crew checked their boarding cards and waved them in. If Rehana happened to be a Muslim female suicide bomber, she could have blown up the airplane and sent all the crew and passengers flying directly to the heavens. No one at the Sahara International Airport checked her small handbag or scanned her body to see whether she had any weapon or a belt fastened with explosives around her waist. It was fairly common at the Bombay International Airport for passengers to check their bags and get their boarding passes and then disappear. Those same passengers would go back to the city and commit murders. The paid killers would later use their boarding passes as alibis to prove that they were out of the country when the crimes were committed. Thank God, Rehana Khan was neither a female suicide bomber nor a paid killer. When the plane took off, she began to shake from her head down to her feet. She was holding onto her seat with one hand and her daughter with the other. She was thinking that they might fall out the plane any moment or the plane would fall out of the sky and they would crash on the ground. Her tears were streaming like a fountain, but her silence did not hide her fear. Those fearsome moments soon passed as the plane began to fly horizontally and Rehana began to think that they had reached their destination. She whispered in the ear of her daughter and told her that they had reached the rich country of the Arabs. This idea was incorrect, for one of the attendants approached her row of seats and asked her in broken Hindi whether she was a vegetarian or a non-vegetarian. Rehana did not understand the question of the pretty young woman. The air hostess checked her boarding pass and saw her name was Rehana. From her name, she knew that Rehana was a Muslim woman and hence she concluded that she was a non-vegetarian. Then she asked her whether she would prefer chicken, beef, or lamb. Rehana, being inexperienced, thought she was sitting in an expensive restaurant and the food would be beyond her budget of 500 rupees. She shook her head indicating that she did not want to eat. The air hostess pointed to her little daughter indicating she should have something to eat. When Rehana rejected the offer for her daughter to have a meal, the air hostess then understood that perhaps the poor Indian woman felt she had to pay for the food. She used an interpreter and told her that the food was already paid for with her tickets. As soon as Rehana heard that the food was free, she changed her mind and said she wanted to eat something as well. She ordered lamb biryani for herself and chicken biryani for her little daughter. Biryani is the most delicious Pakistani and Indian food. It originated in Persia, today Iran, and it was brought to the Indian subcontinent by Iranian travelers and merchants. It is prepared out of tender morsels of chicken meat simmered in a creamy spicy blend of rice, saffron, onion, garlic, ginger, turmeric, cumin, tomatoes, ghee, cloves, cardamom, cinnamon, and mint leaves. It seemed that the person who created this tasty dish used every edible herb and spice in the world to produce this biryani recipe. Biryani is not a daily dish but reserved for very special occasions such as weddings, parties, and holidays. It is also cooked during religious festivals like Ramadan, Eid, Diwali, Christmas, etc. Rehana and her daughter had not often made use of a knife and fork except when they were eating in the public restaurants. They forgot they were in public and started eating the delicious biryani dish as if they were at home in the slum with their fingers and hands. During her 3-week honeymoon with Jamal, Rehana noticed that after every meal they ate in the restaurant, her lover put some money on the table for the waiter. Trying to be generous and gracious for the nourishing and tasty free meal, Rehana took out a note of 5 rupees from her handbag and placed it on the tray for the air hostess to have as a tip. When the air hostess came to collect the empty trays, she laughed and returned the money to Rehana. While she was handing the rupees back, she whispered to Rehana and thanked her for her generosity. She then explained to her that the plane wasn't a restaurant and they didn't accept tips from the passengers. After all the food trays were removed, some of the passengers removed their seat belts and began to move around in the plane. Some of them were going to the restroom and some were just stretching their legs. Rehana thought that the plane had reached the rich land of the Arabs. Therefore, she asked one air hostess to unfasten her seatbelt and her daughter's seatbelt. As soon as they were freed from their seats, Rehana grabbed the hand of her daughter and began to walk her towards the front passenger exit door to the plane. When they reached the door, she caught hold of the handle and was about to pull the door open. An air hostess saw her at the right moment and pulled her hand from the door handle. "What are you doing, madam?" the air hostess screamed at Rehana. "We are going out. Go back to your seats and don't move until we tell you the plane has landed in Jeddah airport." The angry air hostess held Rehana's hand and took her back to her seat. She fastened her and her daughter into their seat belts. Then she informed the rest of the flight crew what had happened. After that, she came back to Rehana followed by another air hostess. The second air hostesses told Rehana never to move again from her seat, and if she or her daughter wanted to use the restroom, she should press the button above her and a flight attendant would come and take her to the restroom. The air hostess then requested that the passengers sitting around and near Rehana not help her unfasten her seatbelt, and if she managed to unfasten her seatbelt by herself, they should notify someone immediately from the flight crew. Consequently, the inexperienced passengers were grounded and imprisoned in their seats until another problem occurred. Before the plane was to land at Jeddah International Airport, the air hostesses distributed forms to the passengers and asked them to fill them out. By filling out the forms, the passengers would avoid unnecessary delays at the airport upon their arrival. The forms were in Hindi, Arabic, and English. Rehana had never been to school in her life and hence the writing on the forms appeared to her to be like ants crawling together and all bunched up. She turned to the passenger who was sitting next to her and asked him to help her fill out the forms. The man was an Indian. He agreed to help the illiterate Indian woman. He began to ask her the questions on the form and then he started to fill in the specific information in the appropriate boxes and lines. "What is your first name, Rehana? Last name, Khan, coming from, Bombay, going to, Jeddah, purpose of visit, maidservant visa, address, I have no address." The gentleman laughed when Rehana said she had no address. Then, he asked her where she used to live before she flew from Bombay. She told him she was from Darvi slum area. The man put as address, Darvi slum area, Bombay. "Passport number, I have no passport." The man was shocked when Rehana said she had no passport. He asked her that question 3 times before he told her to give him her papers so he could find her passport. He was going to show her what her passport looked like. Rehana gave him the tickets, visas, and boarding cards. The man told her that none of the papers she had given him was a passport. Then, he took out his Indian passport, showed it to her, and demanded that she should show him the same official document. Rehana told him that their passports with the Negro boy. The gentleman asked her to look inside her handbag again. Rehana knew she had no passports in her handbag. She handed her entire handbag to him. The man went through Rehana's small handbag and slowly pulled out one Punjabi dress, underwear, and one sari of Rehana, and one dress for her daughter. Then, he searched the empty handbag painstakingly as if he was hunting for gold. Finally, the gentleman was convinced that the slum woman and her daughter somehow entered the plane without their passports. Out of compassion, the gentleman waved his hand to an air hostess and called her to come over and whispered to her that the Indian woman who was sitting next to him along with her daughter had no passports. The air hostess could not believe him. She talked to Rehana to verify the claim of the gentleman. Rehana gave her the same vague answer, "Our passports with the Negro boy." The air hostess happened to be the same one who shouted at her and stopped her from opening the door to the plane. Therefore, she doubted Rayhana's credibility and thought there was something suspicious about her behavior. She returned to the other crew members and informed them about the suspicious behavior of the Indian woman. One of the flight crew drew the conclusion that the Indian woman might be a terrorist, which scared the hell out of the others. Her conclusion was immediately seconded by another frightened air hostess. The belief that Rayhana was a female terrorist was supported and approved by all the members of the flight crew. Even the pilot and co-pilot agreed this woman must be a terrorist. The conclusion was accepted because it was based on several observations. First of all, the air hostess argued that she could not believe someone could pass through all that tight security and checkpoints at the Sahara International Airport without a passport. Secondly, no passenger was dumb enough to try to open the cabin door of a plane while flying in midair as this Indian woman had done. Thirdly, the Indian woman did not pass through the legal route that each passenger had to go through before she could enter the plane. Conclusion: the Indian woman had been smuggled inside the plane by a well-planned and executed terrorist plot. When the flight crew collectively came to believe Rayhana Khan was a female terrorist, they informed the air marshal. The air marshal took the matter seriously. He told the plane crew to try not to alarm the suspected woman. The passengers also should not be informed so as not to cause a panic. The marshal went over to Rayhana and unfastened her seatbelt and asked her to come with him. Rayhana refused to come with him without her daughter. She told him to unfasten the seatbelt of her daughter and then both would come with him. The marshal unwillingly agreed and freed Ifat from her seatbelt too. Then, he asked the two of them to follow him. When they reached the restroom, he told Rayhana to enter inside. This time, Rayhana obeyed his order without demanding her daughter come with her. After that, the marshal called one of the air hostesses and told her to tell Rayhana to remove all her clothes including her underwear. Rayhana refused to remove her clothes when the air hostess told her to do so. The marshal told Rayhana that if she did not remove her clothing he would come in and remove them for her. Rayhana was scared that the angry man might forcefully remove her clothes and tear them, so she removed her Punjabi dress. She felt timid and afraid standing there only in her bra and underwear in front of a man. The marshal wasn't satisfied with her removing her outer dress. He insisted next that Rayhana remove her bra and underwear. Rayhana began to cry. She begged the marshal and asked him not to uncover her nakedness. Nonetheless, the marshal refused to change his mind, and while she stood crying, he shouted at her again and again to remove her bra and underwear. By this time, all of the passengers became aware of the Indian woman suspected of being a suicide bomber and that she might blow up the plane at any moment. Some women and children began to cry. The male passengers were shaking with fear and looking at the lavatory where the female terrorist was expected to carry out her terrorist attack. Some religious passengers began to pray for their unavoidable death. The marshal kept insisting Rayhana completely undress herself while she continued to refuse to obey his orders. When the suspected female terrorist continued to refuse to remove the rest of her clothing, the marshal took one step inside the restroom, screamed at the top of his lungs shouting, "Take off your underwear and bra." Rayhana concluded the angry man was going to rape her. She began to cry out loud and begged him not to come inside. She promised she was going to remove the rest of her clothing. Then, trembling and shaking, Rayhana unwillingly removed her bra and underwear, covering her private parts with her hands. The marshal asked her to put her hands on top of her head and turn around. Rayhana obeyed the order and placed her hands on her head. She had never expected that one day she would stand before a man who wasn't her husband fully naked. Her tears were falling like water down her face and her body was shaking from head to toe. The marshal had a metal detector in his left hand and on his right hand, he was holding a gun and pointing it in her face. Then, he moved one step inside the restroom and began to check the naked body of the suspected female terrorist. His metal detector moved from Rayhana's breasts and passed by her stomach and legs until it reached her feet. After that, he told her to turn around and face the opposite direction. His metal detector moved from Rayhana's shoulders, past her waist, and stopped for a few seconds on her large backside. The marshal had in mind the case of the Nigerian male terrorist, Omar al-Farouk, who inserted the explosive device in his rectum. After satisfied that the suspected Indian woman had nothing inserted inside her private parts, he then asked her to hand to him all her clothes. Rayhana was sweating as if she was inside a sauna. She bent her knees while she was still facing the opposite direction and picked up her scattered clothes piece after piece. She was scared to turn her face toward the angry man. She thought if she made any move without his permission, he would shoot her naked body with all the bullets in the gun. The marshal examined the clothes of Rayhana carefully before he returned them to her. Then, he ordered her to put on her dress. After she dressed herself, the marshal asked her to stay inside the restroom until he returned. He then locked her inside. The marshal was not satisfied with what he did to the mother and then thoroughly checked her daughter. Ifat began to cry when she heard her mother crying inside the restroom. She thought they wanted to kill her mother. She wasn't allowed to enter when they forced her mother to go inside the restroom. Rayhana was so humiliated having had her privacy terribly violated. She was forced to undress herself and expose her nakedness. She was a victim of Islamophobia. After the terrorist attacks of September 11, some people considered every Muslim a terrorist and a walking bomb. After checking her daughter, the marshal went to the seats of the suspected female terrorist and began to search her bag for the hidden bomb and inside and around her seats. Finally, after all the humiliation, embarrassment and mortification she endured, the marshal declared that Rayhana Khan and her daughter were not terrorists. Rayhana was released from her imprisonment in the restroom and allowed to return to her seat along with her daughter. Then and only then did the flight crew begin to question Rayhana about her passport and her daughter's passport. Once again, Rayhana said their passports were with the black Negro boy. All the members of the flight crew did not understand Rayhana except one. It was the hasty air hostess who brought her and her daughter inside the plane. She was able to figure out what Rayhana meant by the Negro boy. She narrated to the flight crew where she met the suspected female terrorist and her daughter and who brought them to her. Then, she laughed until she held her stomach. When she managed somehow to speak through her laughter, she said that the Indian woman and her daughter mistook the black woman who brought them to the checkout for a Negro boy because she had hair like a boy and a face like a man. Thereafter, the air hostess concluded her great observation by saying, most probably the black woman forgot to hand over the passports to them because they were in such a great hurry. This brilliant disclosure of the air hostess solved the mysterious disappearance of Rayhana and her daughter's passports. Wherefore, the flight crew felt relieved and no longer had the problem of a female terrorist on the plane. Shortly after that, the Saudi plane landed at the Jeddah International Airport.